Welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen. We're here again to talk about theory of and about media and communication from people who've been involved in writing that theory and making that theory happen in this city. They might be academics, researchers. We have a very open field as far as this program is concerned. And the point is to have an interesting and ongoing conversation about just what it is that happens in Boston and has influenced our understanding and appreciation of theory, and perhaps even determines what we get up to in our attitudes and behaviour. So I'm delighted to welcome tonight, or this afternoon, Reebee Garofalo. We're going to talk about popular music and his long and esteemed career as a popular music theorist and performer. Indeed, someone who has made a huge and ongoing contribution to popular music. So welcome, Reebee.
Good to be here.
Thanks. So we're interested in understanding how people get to the point in their work. So the history of, or the prehistory of, how you became interested in popular music firstly.
That goes back to my childhood. My mother's whole side of the family were musicians. And I come from a very large extended family, large extended Italian family, which meant that Sunday dinner was at our house. The entire family came to dinner every Sunday, and we ate for probably 8 hours with vaudeville shows and parades and music solos and everything in between each course. So I grew up with music as an integral part of my life. I started playing drums in the 6th grade, I think, and have been playing drums ever since.
Okay, great. And you had a long career at UMass Boston, University of Massachusetts at Boston.
33 years, College of Public and Community Service.
Okay, so the College of Public and Community Service doesn't have the all-important word media in it, or communication.
Or music.
Or music, right. So how did that happen that you became so active, if you like, in and around music in a program like that?
In my tenure file, I made the case that popular music was a human service. They bought that idea.
Okay, so we need to talk about what that means. What do you mean by popular music as a human resource or a human service?
I guess the best description of that can be had by me going back to my political baptism, which was the civil rights movement. This is a movement where music was absolutely indispensable. I mean, it was the thing that kept people sane. It was the thing that gave people power. It was absolutely indispensable. And because of that experience, music and politics have been parallel strands of my life ever since. Mm-hmm. And when they come together, I feel like a whole person, and when they don't, I still do both, but I'm a little more schizophrenic about it.
Right. So as a community resource or a public resource or a public service, how does that work? How does music work in terms of your thinking and your career?
Well, I look for the places where there's going to be connections between music and politics. The civil rights movement was one obvious place where that was the case. In the early 70s, I started producing benefit concerts with a group called Entropy Incorporated, where we produced rock concerts all over New England and then gave the money away to community organizers. And we tried to promote the kind of politics we were advocating in the concerts, so to make that connection. And in '79, that experience culminated for me in the production of a massive Bob Marley concert at Harvard Stadium that was, it's called a Mandala Festival of Unity. It was staged as a benefit concert for all the frontline states in Southern Africa, and we gave all the money away to Southern Africa.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's a very clear connection between music, political life, and organising for around specific campaigns.
There is. And in the two instances that I just mentioned, the the level of dissatisfaction for me was that things were not always as integrated as I would like to see them. And so for me, I want to look for opportunities where the music is actually much more integrated with the organizing and becomes an integral part of that. In the early 80s, we started a group called Rock Against Racism, where we became an after-school program and worked with a lot of kids who would otherwise have been on the street, and just getting into hip-hop and rap and breakdancing, and we tried to orient that in a more educational, political, programmatic direction. So, for example, we would be asked to have the kids perform at International Women's Day. So we would take that occasion to educate them about the women's movement, and they would write raps about International Women's Day, and in that way we tried to integrate things even more.
Right. And was that something that seemed to you, at least and in your experience, to be unique to Boston? What you were doing?
No, I don't think it was unique to Boston. In my experience, these things have been happening all over the country, and the best example of the way these things spread for me is the project that I'm involved in right now, which is the Hunk Festival. Hunk is a festival of activist street bands, and we're talking 30 and 40 piece brass bands that are not your sort of regimented lockstep marching, college marching bands. These are like wild and crazy bands with, 30-foot puppets and fire breathers and all kinds of stuff. My own band, the Second Line Social Aid and Pleasure Society Brass Band, we are a 32-piece New Orleans-style street band. We play for free. We play for demonstrations and we play for funerals.
Really? I wasn't planning on talking about Honk quite so early, but
Okay.
I think the important thing, we will, and I think the important thing to recognise is that there's a incredible connection, as it were, between when the band performs and the audience.
Absolutely.
And that seems to me to be part of what this, if you like, unusual, semi-abstract theoretical idea is, that music actually connects itself with people and gives them a sense of purpose, of motivation, of interest.
Yeah, honk is one of those instances where we're putting theory into practice in a number of ways. In other words, to the average onlooker, there might not be anything unique about honk, except you experience the uniqueness without even being able to name it. And when you take a closer look, you can see that we're doing things very deliberately. Like, for example, we don't use any electricity at honk. We don't use any sound reinforcement. We don't use any stages. Nobody performs on stages. There are no risers to elevate the bands above the audiences. So people are playing at street level, which means there's very little distance, both physical and spiritual, between artist and audience. In some cases, it's hard to tell the players without a program. Audiences become band members very easily in that situation, and we encourage that.
I suppose the obvious question is, what kind of activities and what kind of outcomes have you seen in kind of applying the theory of music as a social practice, music as a community resource that then is transferred into some other kind of real beneficial outcome? Or is that expecting too much precision about the relationship?
No, we are trying to move in two directions in this. We're trying to ally ourselves more directly with political movements and political campaigns that we think would be the occasion for positive social change. Like, for example, in the past year's Hunk Festival, which was Columbus weekend of 2014, we hooked up with a coalition that included SEIU, Jobs for Justice, a number of a number of labor organizations who are waging the campaign to raise the minimum wage to $15 under the slogan "Fight for 15." So we worked with them to set aside a whole portion of the first day of the festival for what we called Hunk for 15. And what we did was we paired political groups who were waging the campaign for the Fight for 15 with their own brass band. And we did so enough in advance that the organizations were able to work with the bands beforehand to try and integrate music with chants, to try and make sure speakers and musicians weren't stepping on each other's toes. So the thing became a much more integrated show with music leading the charge, and it was immensely successful. We ended up doing 5 simultaneous demonstrations in the downtown Crossing area, and we're talking demonstrations like taking over the food court in South Station, shutting down the Wendy's, places that have been very well known for paying the workers a very low wage, a wage that's not sustainable in this economy, and we feel like we contributed another very loud voice to that campaign, one in which the whole campaign is moving forward, I think.
Sure. If we look at the history of popular music since the 50s, when it's generally considered to have been truly popularised with Elvis and slightly before that, we then saw in the 60s and 70s a very clear relationship between what seems to have been popular music, youth culture and protest, and the era of the Vietnam War. So I think it will be interesting to hear your thoughts on what has happened to popular music and whether what you're doing now in Honk is in a sense acknowledging that popular music is no longer fulfilling a kind of protest role in the way it used to, or is that again somewhat off?
This is a long story for me, and let me see if I can break it up into bite-sized pieces.
Sure.
I mean, I want to go back to my experience in the civil rights movement, because I grew up a rock and roller. The music of the civil rights movement was actually a departure for me and an awakening for me. But for me, I also noticed the limitations of acoustic music. I noticed the limitations of folk music. It became clear to me early on that that kind of folk music and that kind of folk music that we were singing in the movement was very useful to the movement internally. It really did energize people. It gave people momentum. It gave people sanity. It gave people power. It got people through a night in jail. But it was never going to reach a mass audience. I mean, it did expand to reach what I would call a national collegiate audience, but never the mass popular audience. And it seems to me that that's absolutely necessary if you're talking about building a mass movement. So it was very interesting for me to see that transition where that folk, got incorporated very slowly and deliberately into the mainstream, and all of a sudden, rock and roll and rock and and soul and R&B musics that had been considered purely entertainment beforehand now came to be seen as something that could be more substantive, that could include more of a political message. That was very interesting to me. One of the limitations for me of the civil rights movement also is that acoustic guitars are too quiet. Okay? When I'm in a demonstration like that, I want to make a very loud noise. Okay? Now, that brings me to the Hunk Festival, because I've now come full circle to, from a career that spans maybe 30 or 40 years of focusing exclusively on mass-mediated music I am now playing acoustic music once again. I mean, these brass bands, for all of the power that we put out, we're totally acoustic. There's no mediation, there's no sound reinforcement, but it does solve the problem for me of music not being loud enough to be appropriate for the demonstration I have in mind. These bands are louder than any electric band I've ever played in.
Right. So it seems that there's a very clear ongoing connection, at least in your own experience, between what happened, well, what's happened in the last, 50 years in popular music in the United States, where music is really, again, going back to that concept of a community service, a community resource. And media is very important, isn't it, in providing this kind of foundational set of ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to belong, what it means to be located.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that, you know, the popular culture is the terrain on which we fight out the struggle for American values, for what it means to, you know, be a person in this society. All of the major debates find their way into popular music somehow.
Right. And it doesn't look like they're going to go away anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. No. That's a good thing.
Yes, certainly. Your career is also, of course, as well as being a drummer in a rock and roll band, as well as Honk, as well as being deeply committed to political activism, has also included a wonderful contribution to academic work. And
I did that too.
You did that too, yes. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Your contributions have been significant in terms of the way that education, particularly I think it's important to point out in a public university, has been able to use music as a resource for education, but also to recognise how important it is to tell generations of young university and college students about the history of rock and roll, about the history of pop.
Yeah, and it was particularly interesting to try and do that in a college of public and community service, which doesn't seem like it would be a good fit. But I had very interesting experiences in teaching the history of popular music to people who were, you know, on track to become social workers and legal aides and you know, human servicey type positions. It gave them, I think, a real feel for what other cultures are like. I mean, I think you can use popular music. I mean, one of the main courses I taught was a course called The Social History of Popular Music, and really what it was an American history course using popular music to tell the story. And you can sort of use popular music in ways that give you insight into all of the major kinds of movements and issues that have affected the society over time. It's a very good vehicle for doing that.
Well, it's also one of the developments in the last 30 years, I suppose, that's been moving pretty rapidly and into a critical mass around cultural studies and media studies, cultural studies in particular, to say, well, we're not just going to study culture as a high art form, we're not just going to study it as an elite or exclusive expression of the elites and their interests, but you know, breaking it down into those kinds of conditions and experiences, as you mentioned before, where popular music and popular culture actually defines what's going on in society.
Yeah, and you can really see that in the way American studies programs are developing all over the country, and now cultural studies programs, et cetera. I mean, that has really taken hold in academia.
Yes. And of course, the academic contribution that you've made, and some people say that this is really secondary. I wouldn't agree with that, but in the documentation that you've put together, for example, your textbook is now...
This guy.
So, Rockin' Out.
Coming soon to a bookstore near you. Actually, there aren't any bookstores anymore.
No, that's right. Coming to a mail order catalogue type of organisation, which I'm not going to mention because I have some reservations about doing online publicity.
Me too.
But nevertheless, Rockin' Out has been a wonderful series of updated texts. I know I've used it myself.
Okay.
And it's a way of providing really simply an education, a detailed education around popular music, which young people don't necessarily have.
Yeah, no, I've been very pleased with the reception of the book. It's now in its 6th edition, and I've taken on a co-author, Steve Waxman, who's just a brilliant researcher and writer, and is sufficiently younger than I am that he can start picking up where my memory of music leaves off. So it's been a very nice collaboration.
Right. Is it difficult from where you see it now? You've recently retired, but from where you see it now to engage young college students in education about popular music? Are they distracted, as it were, and interested in other things?
No, I can get them talking. I mean, the difficulty of teaching a course on popular music is that everyone's an expert.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The difficult part, I think, is getting folks to really read and reflect in a way that's deeper than 140 characters will allow.
Yeah. Right. So the Twitter effect is having an impact on probably.
It does, and in the case of my students, the fact of UMass being a public university means that, you know, many of my students are older than traditional college age. They're single parents. They're working full time while trying to go to school. These are not people that have hours to spend in the library.
Sure.
So trying to figure out how to get the most out of an education, how to get the most out of a classroom setting is a challenge.
Yeah, I can see that. What about the influence of popular music outside of a city like Boston and in various parts or regions of the country? How do you see that as being differentiated? Are there different ways that music operates, let's say in the Deep South or in California, which has a tradition, the kind of hippie tradition? Is there something, or as universities here and in Boston, it's a real university town. Is there any sense?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly regional differences in the way culture develops, but there's even, I would say, more in terms of the way the infrastructure of the industry develops. Because Boston, for example, has so many colleges.
Right.
It has so many college radio stations as well, and that puts a whole different kind of spin on the kind of music that's going to come to the fore. I mean, college radio stations, unlike the commercial stations, are not beholden to the marketplace for their playlists, so they can play much more experimental stuff. They can afford to go deeper and wider than most of the commercial stations can, and that has a real effect on the way people tend to appreciate the diversity of cultures that exist.
Right. And I think it's important to recognise that's somewhat privileged, isn't it? A privileged position. But it also means that if you don't have that wealth of information and as a source of knowledge around popular music, it may be that you can learn things in a slightly different way. Maybe through live performance or through small clubs like in the old days of the blues, for example.
Live performance is coming back.
It's a different, but the conversation about knowledge is important,
yes.
It seems to me.
Yes.
And what has been part of your career trajectory, and I know through the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, there's been a very interesting conversation about the relationship between knowledge and popular music.
Yeah, and the fact that the association exists in 35 countries really gives it a perspective on global development that very few organizations have, and I think it's really valuable to bring that experience into a classroom as well.
Sure. Now we should also mention, in terms of your contribution to the knowledge of popular music, this wonderful chart. So we're going to have a little piece of performance here as we roll out the latest iteration of this chart that Reebee has worked on for many years. You can see it starts over here. It's called Pop Waves. On my side here, Pop Waves. It says coming soon as a colour enhanced, easy to read, etc. That's for people who are getting older. But the fact of the matter is that it traces the history of performers, groups, individuals, and their genres from person to person. So if you were to get a reasonable close-up, you could probably see, maybe not at this distance, the way that the Reebee has traced each particular and important popular music performer, band, and their genre, and show the continuity across history. And of course, this is extremely important in terms of how people understand the role of popular culture and popular music in society, and popular music as not only, of course, an art form, but as something that connects one person to another, one performer to another. It's not as if something comes out of nowhere. It comes from a long and esteemed tradition of popular music production and creativity. So thank you for bringing that in, Reebee. It starts here in 1955. It goes over there till 2013.
Actually, there's an addition now. It goes up to 2014, and if you check into the website historyshots.com in about 2 weeks, this will be available as a poster.
All right, so that's 2 weeks from pretty much the end of February, so that's fantastic. Thank you, Reebee, for bringing that in, and thank you for your contribution to, again, that production of knowledge, important knowledge. And I think with that we can say thank you very much to Reebee Garofalo for being here.
It's been great doing it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That's all from Boston Media Theory for tonight. I'm Marcus Breen, and until next time, we'll see you. Good night.